there, Booksy. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to A Closer Book. This is a series where I talk about 3 of my recent reads. Today we're going to break tradition and we're going to talk about 4 books because one of the books is a book that we discussed at length for the book club. Singh Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward was the book club pick for the Run Right Reads book club in January. We had an hour-long live stream in January. So much of what I could say right now has probably already been said, so I will just tell you that this was a pretty well written book. It's about Jojo, who's 13 when we meet him, which means traditionally that this is the age when he's about to become a man. And so when we meet him, he's going through that ritual with his maternal grandfather, Pop. Jojo is from a mixed race family. His mother is African American, his father is Caucasian. His mother's a drug addict, his father is in jail, and so he's been living with his grandparents, and his mother stays there, but she's not accepting responsibility really for him because she doesn't really have responsibility over her own life. She's a functional drug addict, and she is obsessed with her boyfriend, Jojo's father. So she leaves her children, she abandons her children's needs in order to cater to her boyfriend. And so when we meet Jojo, his grandfather is inviting him to participate in killing an animal, and Jojo says, "I know what death looks like." And this foreshadows the rest of the book because they're family members and friends who have died but who make appearances in the book in the way of ghosts, as well as Jojo's grandmother is sick. She's dying of cancer, and we have to see the family come to terms with her impending death and how these different people, how these different characters deal with the idea of death. The grandmother herself and the people that she asks to help her pass over to the other side. So this is a book about life and death and what you do to deal with either one. There's a supernatural element to the book, of course, because we talked about these dead characters reappearing as ghosts and haunting the family, and their ability to see and interact with these spirits. So this was not something that I necessarily like to read about. If I had known about that supernatural element, this is not a book that I might have picked up. But it is very well written, very descriptive, deals with some very relevant themes. The book is set in Mississippi, and so there's racial conflict. The fact that half of Jojo's family is African American and traditionally being oppressed by the other half of his family, the white Southerners, who have the history in this book of being enslavers. They're guilty of continuing the racial profiling and the segregation and the racial injustice, makes it a difficult subject to read about, but it is also a very relevant and timely book to read. Next, I read Disgraceful by J.M. Coetzee. This is his Man Booker Prize-winning novel. I am trying to read all the books that have won the Man Booker Prize in its 50-year history. I'm doing this Man Booker 50 challenge, so if you're new to the channel, I'm gonna link the video where I talk about that if you want to check it out. This one is set in Cape Town in South Africa in the period after apartheid has ended, and so the main character is a professor who is of white European descent. He's twice divorced, and at the time when we meet him, he's not in a significant relationship, but he is having what he considers to be a relationship with a prostitute, and he becomes obsessed with her, and through his obsession we get to see how he feels about women. He has very little regard for them as anything other than possessions, and he tries to convince the women as well as the reader of his right, his privilege to that position. In what should be a disgraceful situation, he begins a relationship with one of his female students. The pretty nonchalant reaction that this Professor Lurie has at losing his job and the consequences of his action will kind of anger you if you're a feminist, or if you have a strong visceral reaction to him abusing his authority and starting this relationship with this young woman, because part of you feeling vindicated by his losing his job is that it is him losing something that means something to him, but he kind of acts like he doesn't care, like none of the consequences mean anything to him. So finally he goes off into self-imposed exile. He goes to live with his adult daughter, and the way she's described makes her seem like a caricature. She's supposed to be a very modern woman living in a commune and being surrounded by these farmers who are seeking a simpler life even though they don't have to. Lucy becomes kind of like an allegory, a prototype to show us what it's like as Africans of European descent versus Africans of Black original African descent seek to live together in these communes, seek to find a way to coexist, where the power has now been returned to the Blacks and the whites are supposed to be on equal footing. Lucy is the target of a violent attack, but her very passive reaction to the violence makes it feel like she's overcompensating for all the things that her ancestors have done to the Africans before her. So she's pretty content to just let these black men come in and do whatever they want to her house, to her property, to her body. That evoked a very strong reaction in me. I haven't read a book that was set in this post-apartheid period before, and he talked very candidly about the rage that one feels regardless of where one is in the racial divide. I wanted to really like the book. I wanted to give it a 5-star rating, but again, the way that the author wrote these women and the way they pandered to this male character who is self-described not a very attractive man in any way, I couldn't. So at the end, I think this is a 4-star read for me. Not because I didn't find the story very intriguing and very engaging, but because there were things that bothered me about the way the women were characterized. As a woman, I felt a little offended, and so I can't give him a 5-star rating. I've kept it to 4, even though it was a well-written book. Next, I read Chemistry by Wiki Wang, and this is about an unnamed narrator. She is a chemistry PhD student. When we meet her, her boyfriend was a year ahead of her in college. They met in the chemistry lab, and he's now graduated and is, finding academic positions across the country, and asks her to marry him and move with him across the country to start a life together. Unfortunately, she's not able to commit to moving away with him, but she's also not able to commit to breaking up with him, because even though the relationship brings her fear, it's one that she still clings to, kind of like a port in a storm, a drowning man clutching at straws. So the reason that she is unable to make these commitments, number one, is because she keeps comparing herself to her mother. Her mother and her father moved to the United States as immigrants. They left China. And when they left, her mother had a good job, was coming from a good family. And she abandoned everything to move with her husband to the United States. But when she came here, she wasn't able to make the adjustment and assimilate the way he was. And so she's been dependent on him pretty much for the rest of her marriage. And that dependency has brought about resentment. And the narrator, the main character, she doesn't want to do that. Number one, because she's also failing in her career. So her accepting what her boyfriend is proposing to her feels like she's also accepting the failure of her career, much like her mother did before her. She also looks at pioneers in science, like people like Marie Curie, who she considers to have been very intelligent and made very important strides in the science, except that Marie Curie's recognition is forever tied to her husband's, and much of what she accomplished is often downplayed because more focus is given to the relationship that she had as opposed to her individual accomplishment. And so this character, in comparing herself to these pioneers in relationships but also in science, she feels unable to make that move because she doesn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, but that fear also keeps her from making any moves, whether they're mistakes or not. It's interesting that in this book, the author chose to name quite a few of the characters, but leave a lot of them unnamed. Like, we know the boyfriend's name is Eric, and we know the mother's name, but most of the other characters are not named. The main character, we never know her name. The best friend is just called best friend. The dog is just called dog. The baby is just called baby. The fact that the author chose to keep these main characters unnamed made them kind of caricatured characters in this stream of consciousness exploration of physical science turned social science. The main character is not unlikable, although the hopeless romantic reader might want to throw something at her every time she rebuffs her boyfriend, who kind of comes off as a good guy. But she is understandable because she's narrating her own story, and so she gains our empathy as she tells us the story of her childhood and how she grew up seeing her parents going through the motions and on what their life is like now. I enjoyed the chemistry references that weren't just regurgitation of facts that I already knew, but that were cleverly constructed into crafty puns and witty criticisms, because it showed the author's mastery of not just the science of chemistry, but also her ability to write a really engaging novel and to produce something of high literary quality. I wish this book had been around when I was in college, trying to marry the idea of having a writing career as well as also becoming an engineer. Finally, The Heart of Henry Quantum by Pepper Harding. This is a pseudonym. The Heart of Henry Quantum is a split narrative novel. We're following three main characters: Henry, his wife Margaret, and his ex-girlfriend Daisy. We meet Henry on the morning of December 23rd. He is deciding to buy a bottle of perfume as a last-minute Christmas gift for his wife Margaret. On his way to the store, he encounters Daisy, with whom he had a relationship that was an adulterous relationship during the time that he's been married to Margaret. Having met Daisy, they go for lunch and they go through this process of re-examining their relationship as well as some of the decisions that they made to start an affair but also to end it, and a discussion of the time that has passed since their relationship ended and whether it was for the best or not. Next, we move over to Margaret's narrative. She's also in the process of carrying out an adulterous relationship, and so we get her stream of consciousness as she tries to justify the relationship that she is now beginning, some of the choices that she's made, how she's changed in her relationship, and whether this relationship that she has with her husband is for the best or not. And finally, we get the perspective of Daisy, who, although her name suggests freshness, Daisy is a divorced mother of 2 adult children, and so that kind of gives us a little context on the ages of the characters. The entire book is set in one day, but occasionally we get flashbacks as both Henry and Margaret revisit Henry's college days and how both characters were different back then, how their relationship started, and the changes that have happened in the characters that have caused them to drift apart. We also get to see Daisy as a younger woman and in her relationship with Henry, but most of all, this is just like a stumbling of events. Overall, there's some interesting discussions of science terms, particularly quantum theory, and there's an allusion to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is that you can either know how fast an object is moving or where it is. You can't know both at the same time. But in general, there wasn't much of a plot or resolution to this book. It's not something that I would recommend for anyone to pick up, except if you're interested in books that have science terms but aren't really geeky reads. So that's a closer look at these 4 recent reads. Leave me a comment down below if you've read any of them and if you want to chat about them a little bit more. And until next time, happy reading.